let me just start by getting a feel. Are all of you guys parents? Is anybody here not here because of tutor?
Admin, DC Public.
Oh. Yeah.
Child therapist. Special educator.
Great. Yeah.
Grandparent.
Grandparent.
Substitute teacher here.
Oh, great. Okay, good. So, and let me just to give me a feel for the person that you're here for, whether you're a parent or a therapist or somebody else. How many of you are here for somebody whose sort of official diagnostic label is ADHD, learning disabilities? Okay. Any of you have kids who have autism diagnostic labels? Okay. So I'm going to talk to you today about executive functions, and I'm talking to you about, can you guys hear me? Okay. I'm talking to you about really the last kind of 2 decades of my work with an extended group, as you'll see, of wonderful folks at Children's. A lot of our work came out of our experience with kids on the autism spectrum, and I'll try to flag for you when I'm speaking more specifically to that. But the interventions and approaches that I'm talking about actually initially developed with kids who had traumatic brain injury, and now we're applying in autism and also in ADHD. So the issue is really about executive functions, and those are very fragile functions for kids. They are impaired in lots of different disorders, and if you have a problem with executive functions, you need treatment for that, and that's what we're going to talk about. So I just wanted to kind of explain that a little bit, and if you have other questions about that as we go along, let me know. So what I want to do is to make sure that you leave here with some specific tools for helping kids who have executive function problems become more independent and effective. How many of you in this room think of executive functions as a primary problem for your kid? How many of you think of it as a major problem for your spouse or mother-in-law? How many of you have never heard the word executive functions before? Or you've heard it, but you're not quite sure you know what we mean by it. So we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about what it is and what I mean by it, because I think many of us use it in somewhat different ways. So my goal for today is to increase your understanding of executive functions and how we enhance them or improve them. And I have a plan for doing that, and I'm going to start by defining executive functions and why they matter for outcomes. I am the parent of 3 boys, all of whom have ADHD diagnoses of one type or another. And so I know from personal experience that what we really want to know is, how do I make that happy, well-functioning 21-year-old, right? That's why we're here. That's why you're here at night when you could be at home reading a book, right? So that, in the world of research, we call that outcomes, right? So it's fine to talk about executive functions in your 7-year-old, but we want to know, what is that going to mean for how he grows up and becomes effective in the world in many different ways. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to talk about some specific executive function deficits, what they are and how we can accommodate them, and then we'll talk about how we teach those skills. So to start with, what is executive function? When I use that word executive function, I am talking about actually a set of things that your brain does. And this lives in a very specific set of neural circuitry. I think Martha Denkla was here recently. I don't know if any of you heard her, but she's one of the neurologists who sort of helped us to understand this. But this lives in the prefrontal subcortical circuitry of your brain. So there's a specific place in the brain where we have executive function abilities, and it's a set of things that your brain does, and together they help you efficiently carry out goal-directed behavior. Efficiently being the operative word. So what I'm not talking about here is how smart you are. I'm talking about what you do with your knowledge and how the process by which you take in new knowledge. I'm talking about how it is that you regulate your thinking, your behavior, and your emotions as you're dealing with new information, new situations, or you're having to produce or integrate large amounts of material. Okay? So just to hit this point home, I want to take a really basic example, and I want to talk about grocery shopping. Because I think all of us here are smart enough to grocery shop, right? We have the knowledge of what it is we would need to do to grocery shop, and to do it effectively. But most of us have had the experience of not doing it particularly efficiently, okay? And just like executive functions are a very fragile function in a child's brain, they're kind of fragile in our brains too, okay? You can throw off your executive functions by not getting enough sleep, not eating food, being really anxious, right? So think back to there must be probably some time in your life when you tried to grocery shop or some other equivalently simple task when you were feeling stressed or tired or you weren't at your best executive functions. And what you might see is that although you're smart enough to grocery shop, you're not actually doing that in an efficient way, okay? And the first set of issues that you might encounter would be cognitive, that you're not regulating your thinking and using your thinking to regulate your actions the way you wish that you might. Anybody ever sat on the couch on a Saturday morning and thought, I need to go to the grocery store and I just can't quite get off this couch, right? That's about initiation. That's the first step that we do when we start thinking about and trying to solve a problem. We get ourselves going. And then you need to have a plan. Anybody ever gone to the grocery store where you hadn't thought about what you want to eat that week before you get there? And you hadn't looked in the cupboard to see what you had or what you needed to buy? And so, there I am like trucking down the meat. I think I'll make meatloaf. Do I have ketchup? That whole process is happening while I'm in the store and everything's slowing down, right? There's working memory, which is another big part of cognitive regulation, which is keeping track of information at the moment. It is not long-term memory. It's not your hard drive or your card catalog if you're old-fashioned like me. It is the immediate information you're using at the time. Have you ever forgotten whether you already put something in the cart yet? Right? That's working memory. You're working with that right now. You should know whether or not the milk's there or it's not there. Or somebody gives you directions when you're trying to get to a job interview and you're anxious because you think you're late and you cannot for the life of you keep track of whether they told you to go right or left and left or right next. That's working memory. Then you got to organize and integrate information. If you go to a new store, likely you're going to think, I'm going to go to the produce section first, right? And then I'm going to get all the produce. I'm not going to buy the beans, walk halfway across the store and go back to get the strawberries, because that's not using the organization of the store to help me be efficient in my problem solving, okay? There are people with significant executive function problems where if they walk into a new store that they haven't been in, it's kind of news to them that, hey, the produce is going to have all the produce like it always does, right? They're missing that organization, that integration information. There's behavior regulation. Have you ever shopped when you were really hungry? And then you're eating those Milano cookies before you've thought about why you came to the store in the first place. You're not inhibiting your impulses, right? And that's going to slow you down in terms of getting what you need to do done, as well as, for some of us, lead to other adverse effects in the long term. Right? There's emotion regulation. And this we find in our recent research, flexibility really links in here. So interestingly, if you go to the store and I'm intent on making this really good pear tart I make for people, got some people coming to dinner on Saturday night, and I get to the store and the pears are all hard as rock, like they are sometimes around here. And I have trouble being flexible at that moment. I stand there and I'm mad and I'm like, produce in this town is so expensive and it's so bad, and we got Safeway and we got Giant and they're not competing properly, and I'm just stuck, right? Until I flexibly switch and say I'm going to make apple pie instead, I'm wasting my time. And I'm not being efficient in seeking to meet the goal. The efficiency of my goal-directed behavior is impaired by flexibility. I want you to know I have not lost emotional control in the supermarket, right? Maybe some of us have, but you've certainly seen kids who do, right? Whose executive function is a little less strong. Is this coming alive for you about what it is that I'm talking about here? And as we're talking about this, you're thinking about the child that you care about. And your child probably isn't necessarily being sent off to grocery shop on their own, but they may have some of these same issues with other simple routine tasks. Like, anybody have a kid who doesn't get out of the house in the morning in an efficient way? Okay, so you can think then about whether they're having trouble getting started. They don't have a clear sense of what the plan is. They lose track of what the steps are. They're not organizing the big picture, which is I need to get to school at a certain time, right? All of these issues, all right? Okay, so with that definition of executive function in mind, we want to stop now and think about the fact that executive function has a lot to do with these important outcomes, these happy, well-functioning 21-year-olds. How do we get there? And that's because executive dysfunction, as Teuber said back in 1964, when you have executive dysfunction, there is a curious dissociation between what you know and what you do, because it's a process function, right? How many of your kids have been put into a study skills class specifically, and that was kind of it? They did the study skills class and then they moved on, and whether or not they benefited wasn't entirely clear to you. Have you had this experience? Okay, a few of you. Most of you, because you're at lab, think I'm speaking a foreign language here. But a typical executive function intervention in a public school is go to this class. Usually it happens around middle school. Come in, and we're gonna tell you some things. You need to keep your notebook organized. And I want you to fill out your agenda. If you fill out your agenda, you'll do better, okay? And I'm even going to help you. Let's put some color-coded tabs in your notebook. Okay, now it's clear. That's what you need to do. You got that? Okay. Bye, right? That's knowledge, right? Most of the kids know that that's what they're supposed to do, but they don't know how to do it. They're not doing it, right? And that's why places like lab are so important, because you have people here who are demonstrating and showing and teaching every day, not just what they should be doing, but how they do that, the process. And what we see when we recognize that executive dysfunction is this dissociation between what you know and you do, is that when we start to study that, executive function problems relate closely to how you learn. We can look at the executive functions of a preschooler and predict how well they'll do in math and reading in first and second grade, because learning is all about taking in new information, processing information effectively, and using it to change how you understand what you need to do next. Kids have much more of a problem in this area than us adults. How many of you can show up at work and do exactly what you did yesterday, and somebody will pat you on the back for it and say, good job, because you're good at what you do, right? But you can't do that as a kid. Every day you got to show up and learn something new. It also relates to adaptive skills, and I'm going to talk more about this one in a minute. It relates in, is this news to anybody? Family stress. It's hard on us parents and teachers and therapists of kids who have these executive problems, because they're constantly not quite doing what we think they should be doing, and we're not quite sure how to help them. It also has a close relation when we look at adult outcomes, employment, whether you're employed at the level of your education, for instance, whether you're in a meaningful relationship, all these kinds of things. Let's talk about this adaptive skills a little bit more. And this is data that does come from autism, although that's because our research is in autism. There are other really important, this is not in your slides, in your paper, I think. I forgot to put it in. But there's the same analogous type of data in the ADHD folks as well. This is work done by a fellow of ours, Cara Pugliese. And I just want to give you some take-homes here. First of all, this is a pretty large group of kids. This is 421 kids. And like a lot of your kids here at lab, these guys all had IQs that are around 100, 105 on average. That's average. That's a good, solid IQ. That means you know enough to do just fine in the world, okay? So good, check, right? But then there's a separate set of data that we collect, and this we collect from parents. And if you've done an assessment where you got interviewed about whether or not your kid brushed his teeth or knew how to use a microwave or shared his toys, those are adaptive behavior questions. And what's being asked there of the parent is, what does your kid actually do in the real world? on a regular basis in terms of communicating what he wants, following directions, sharing information. That's communication. Daily living skills, what does he do in terms of dressing himself? Does he take medicines on his own? Does he know how to, make a simple meal? And then socialization in terms of social skills. And parents answer these questions, and we score this measure, and we score it on exactly the same set of metrics as we use for the IQ. So we get these scores down here, and these scores are for each of these domains of functioning, communication, daily living, and socialization. And then they're broken down by age group. So the youngest kids, the 4 to 5-year-olds, are over here. The oldest kids are here, the 14 to 20-year-olds. And so these are their average scores on adaptive behavior. These are their average IQs. Do you notice a problem? Yeah. Right. That's a problem. And that's a problem in ADHD, and it's a problem in autism, and it's a problem if your kid has a reading disability diagnosis. They have a narrower executive problem, but we still see this. This gap is actually why you guys hauled your butts out tonight to come see me. Because this is what you're scared about when you're thinking about the 21-year-old. Am I going to college with you? Seriously? Is that what's going to happen next? And it's because they know a lot, but they don't show it on a regular basis at home. And what Kara was able to show was that problem, that gap, is explained by IQ as we expect, but also by aspects of executive function like working memory and flexibility. So when parents identify flexibility, working memory, other executive problems, it relates directly to their adaptive behavior. And that's one important way that we think about outcomes. Making sense? Now, in terms of executive functions and why they matter to outcomes, there's also another really important thing that is at the core of what we believe is important about the way we have to think about executive functions if we're going to intervene effectively to help people who have problems. And that has to do with this issue that we can get confused with executive function problems and think that they are a choice on a child's behavior, something that the child is refusing to do or won't do, when in fact they might be can'ts, right? And this happens with executive function. It can happen with any learning disability, as the people here at Lab can tell you, and you can experience for yourself. But it's easier if your kid has a reading disability. It's easier to recognize that she shows up on time to math class. She has the field trip slip when she gets to social studies. She knows where her lunch is, and she has her gym clothes, and she participates well and brings her homework in throughout the day. She gets to reading class and she can't read, okay? It's kind of obvious there's something that she can't do there, right? If you have executive dysfunction, you don't make it out of the house on time, you haven't brushed your hair, your notebook is a disaster, you don't have any of the homework you were supposed to do, you haven't brought the materials that you told the science teacher you were so excited about making the rocket, but then you show up without the materials you were supposed to bring from home. It shows up in every step of what you do. So it affects you clearly 24/7. And that makes it easier for those of us watching you cute little kid with a good IQ and a big vocabulary and think, you just must not care, right? You're not trying. I don't see where you're trying. And so I'm going to get confused and think that when you actually might be stuck, you might have a brain-based flexibility problem where you can't shift from one thing to another, I'm going to look at you and say, you're just stubborn. Give it up already. Let's move on. Let's do something else. You might be a person who is getting completely overloaded, and we'll talk about how executive function drives overload and having, situations where you really, melt down, you refuse to do the homework, you won't, help the person come in to get help with the math you don't understand. You look like you're refusing to control your behavior when in fact you're overloaded and disinhibited. Does this make sense? This can't, won't? Does anybody have questions about it? Because it's fundamental to we have to make this shift. And it is not always the case that kids can't do things, right? We all have experience with our kids where we know you're actually making a choice here, right? That's what makes this so hard for us as parents and teachers is we've got to figure out at each moment whether we're dealing with a can't or a won't. Because the fact of the matter is, if it is a can't and you treat it like a won't, you are actually powerless, right? There is no reward I can give the truly dyslexic child that will make her learn to read if I don't go in and teach her how to break words down into sound units, right? So I could reward her, I could punish her, I could do whatever behavioral thing I want that reflects the fact that she just needs to pull her socks up and read, but I won't be successful, right? And the same is true for executive function. I can, and I have, yelled at my child, that if he doesn't get out the door in this instant, then we are going to have a complete meltdown in this household. But it doesn't work when the fact is that he's stuck on something else and doesn't see the big picture and doesn't know what the goal is. So this is the key moment where we realize, we got to do a little experiment here. We're going to have to figure out if this thing that our kid is not doing that is making us close our eyes and think he's never leaving the house, I've got to come up with like, a long-term care plan, right? We got to stop and think that behavior, is that a can't or is it a won't? And we're going to run some experiments to try to figure that out. And that's what this talk is going to try to unpack. So my goal was to increase your understanding of executive functions, and my plan was to start by defining executive functions and why they matter. We good on that part? Let's talk about some specific executive function deficits, how to understand and recognize them, and think about whether they're can'ts or won'ts, and then what kind of accommodations we need to make. And here I'm jumping into a lot of intervention strategies that I developed with this incredibly wonderful team of folks, some of whom come from the Ivy Mount Model Asperger program and the Take Two Summer Camp, Katie Alexander, Lynn Cannon, and Monica Werner, and then some of whom were at Children's, Laura Anthony, John Strang, Carrie Pugliese. We do have these two books that are on this executive function intervention we developed, which is like a cognitive behavioral strategy, and then a parent guidance book. This is right now written for people on the autism spectrum. We're in the middle right now of running a big trial in DC and Virginia in schools, charter schools and public schools, with kids with ADHD. And we're seeing some nice results, but we don't have those results yet. So stay tuned. All right. The first pillar of the unstuck and on-target intervention philosophy is that you accommodate before you try to remediate. You accommodate before you try to teach a new skill. And there's two reasons why we think this is fundamental. And the first reason is that it's the right thing to do. Okay? We believe we have grown as a society, and we are better as a society because we include all races and religions and sexes and even ages. We're going to work on that ageism thing. But we know that that enriches us and makes us smarter and better and more productive. And the next, I think, horizon is this issue of neural diversity, that different kinds of brains enrich us as a culture. And you can see now companies saying, we're going to actually target hiring people who have, autism or whatever it may be, because we need those people, okay? So it's the right thing to do. It will make us stronger. And your kids and my kids have just as much right to those accommodations as a person who's in a wheelchair has, right? None of us would bat an eyelash about the fact that a lab needs to have a ramp so that that kid can get to school without having to crawl up the stairs, right? Now, the same is true for our kids. They don't necessarily need that physical ramp, but they may be just as exhausted and debilitated by the time they get into class without the accommodations that they need as that child who depends on the wheelchair would be. So neural diversity is the right thing to do, and it's going to help us get kids into the classroom who are ready to learn. Because guess what? If you don't do these accommodations, you get a bunch of overwhelmed people. Anybody can picture what I mean by your kid being overwhelmed, right? And when people are overwhelmed, they don't learn very well. None of us learn very well when we're overwhelmed. We are not then in a position to get new information. So it's the right thing to do, and it's the only smart thing to do. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the basic accommodations that we need to think about having in place. And can't versus won't is the first one, and the one that we've already just talked about. I'm going to talk now about predictability and structure, making the big picture explicit, talking less, writing more, avoiding overload, and keeping it positive. So to do that, I want to start to talk about some specific aspects of executive dysfunction. So you remember me in the grocery store with the hard pears, or maybe it's you when your computer doesn't do what you think it should do and you keep pushing the same button, right? That's stuck. Stuck is something that is represented universally in the autism spectrum. About half of the kids who are studied who have ADHD also have flexibility problems, and they actually have some of the most risky outcomes in terms of developing oppositional defiant disorder, a term I hate because it's a big-time won't term. So I'm having these guys speak to you about the experience of having an inflexible brain. They all have Asperger's, but as I'm wanting you to think about the fact that many kids with executive dysfunction have inflexibility problems. Not all ADHD kids, not all reading kids, but you can think about whether your child does or doesn't have this issue. They're just describing what their experience is of having Asperger's. These guys are were Ivy Mount students. They've grown up now.
You think that sums it up?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Asperger's is also like, it's also like having a kind of, what do you call it? A clamp. A clamp. It's like having a clamp
Vice.
on your brain. Yeah, a vice. Yeah. And you know, every situation you're unfamiliar with, every little change in the routine, you know, something that might upset you, gives you a cord return on the clamp, you know, on the vice, you know, and it just makes you more pressure and more tight until you really have to let it all out. And sometimes it's just, there are many ways of letting it out, and sometimes you just pick the wrong one.
What kinds of things make that vice tighten up?
You want me to take this one, Gabe?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
You're the one who said vice thing, so go ahead.
Yeah, okay. A vice, you know, things that make the vice tighten up is, it's,
A sudden change in plans?
yeah,
That's a good one.
sudden change in plans, you know, something that, you didn't expect to happen, you know. For example, a flat tire in the car when you really want to get to a birthday party.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that can mess up your whole day, and you just, and that when that vice gets tighter, you know, it kind of, keeps your whole day kind of, uneasy, you know.
Do any of you have a kid or know a kid that you can watch getting increasingly uneasy in a day, that you can watch kind of rising in them, that difficulty? I think that what's so powerful about the way Peter there in the middle described that is he's really describing what it is to have an inflexible brain in the world that demands flexibility all the time. Learn a new thing, do the math this way instead of that way this time. You know, no, we're not going outside for recess because it's raining, or, you know, we thought we were having pizza, but we're not. That when you have an inflexible brain, the experience of dealing with those flexibility demands is basically like medieval torture, right? He has a vice on his head, a metal vice, and it gets tighter each time there's a demand for him to be flexible. And what I think is powerful about that is it helps us to recognize what's sort of an unseen phenomenon, that all we see is a kid kind of getting tenser, getting maybe more surly, maybe more irritable, maybe more anxious, getting maybe a little bit less appropriate. And in fact, what he's experiencing is this pressing demand to be flexible when he finds that very hard to do. So when we think about cognitive inflexibility and what it looks like at school and at home, we're having to think about, are we looking at can'ts or won'ts, right? Almost everybody in the world doesn't accept feedback sometimes. But there are some kids for whom accepting feedback, going back and revising, how many kids are like, people have kids like mine where it's like, look, I want you to take what you just wrote and just make a couple, no, Mom, I'm not going to change anything, right? Right? So, that's feedback, and it's harder to accept feedback when you are not naturally flexible, right? So, like I said, my 3 kids have ADHD. One of them is also not very flexible, and boy, we just gave up on revising. That was just not going to happen in this house, The middle one is much more flexible, and so that piece is much easier for him to do. But you have also kids who have just a huge amount of trouble starting something they don't want to do or stopping something even when they've been told to stop. And that's another sign. Maybe there's some inflexibility piece going on here. And then you start to do experiments, whether or not you're looking at a can't versus a won't. And the first thing you do is you just pay a lot of attention. Does the fact that I've screamed at the kid, the last 12 times he's done this, has this had any impact on him? Well, no, then I got a little more rational and I took away something he really wants. Did that improve the behavior? If I'm not having any impact on the behavior, then maybe I should go back and think, maybe he can't do this. Does it help him if I give him a warning in advance? Does it help him if before I say, let's just change this paragraph you wrote, in fact, before you even start to write the paragraph, if I say, this is going to be this 3-step process. You're going to write something, I'm going to read it, you're going to make some changes. That's the way it always is, right? That forewarning, that structuring, those are all things that if you find that they help your kid, then you've got some cognitive flexibility issues. And here are some of the basic kinds of accommodations, the wheelchair ramps that we need to put in place for the inflexible brain. One is really reliable schedules and routines, knowing when things are going to happen, post a schedule. Saturday is really confusing to inflexible people because God knows what's going to happen, right? Being very clear about what your expectations are, doing that thing of priming and forewarning a kid when something's going to happen. For kids who get overwhelmed by intense feelings, thinking about breaks and downtime where they can get a break away from what's stimulating them. And then one thing you'll notice that for all these different kinds of flexibility problems, there's one consistent accommodation that's useful. What is it? Flexible adult. Anybody in this room had an inflexible kid and an inflexible relative or parent or teacher? It's not good, right? Goes into that toilet very fast. So, and that's a key thing to think about, and that's why places like Lab individually match kids and teachers, right? Because we're all different, and we need to find the good match. And it's every person's right, if your kid isn't at Lab, to say, we need to talk about the match between this kid and this teacher, or you can't quite say this kid and this grandparent. In that case, you have to do some different things, but maybe the visits get a little shorter, right? Now, I'm going to actually I can't skip over this. I think this is really important. Again, this is another autism example. This guy's Ari Naiman. He's on the President Obama's Disabilities Council. He's also the president of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. He has Asperger's syndrome, and he's incredibly smart, and he's helped us to think about these interventions as we've developed them. And one of the things that he wanted to make sure that we understood was that inflexibility actually is adaptive if you are a person who has trouble being flexible. And so it limits these other unexpected overwhelming events for people. And so sometimes when kids are rigid, they're really doing what they need to prevent themselves from getting completely overwhelmed and acting inappropriately. And the example that he gave was to us, to try to get us to understand what he was talking about, was if you worked here and your house was here, and in between there was a minefield, and you found one safe way to go to work, you would not really be open to trying a different way, right? Because it's a minefield. And for these kids, when they get overwhelmed and upset, it has a big impact. They may not be having such great peer interactions anyway. They may be struggling to be liked by other kids. And maybe then when they get overwhelmed and upset, they burst into tears, or they get really grouchy, or they do things that further alienate people. It's not a safe world for them. Yes?
Did you mention his name?
Ari Naiman. Wonderful guy. ASAN, A-S-A-N, is I think it's asan.org, is the website for his group, Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. So we want to respect inflexibility when we can. If your kid likes to have exactly the same routine when he gets home after school, that's probably really okay, right? It's probably not going to interfere in a big way with his being that happy, well-functioning 21-year-old, right? If your kid cannot accept that grandma's at dinner and he's going to sit next to her, that's probably not okay. That's probably something that you do have to work around. But you can pick your battles here, and that's important. So we've talked about this predictability and structure being important for the kids who have these flexibility problems. Now let's move on and talk about the issue of kids who have difficulty organizing and integrating information. This is one of the core flexibility deficits that we see in almost every kid with ADHD, ASD, traumatic brain injury. These are the ones we study a lot, reading disabilities. This is a big one, okay? So probably there's some component of these issues for your kid. And here I'm going to show you a neuropsychological tool, because I'm a neuropsychologist. I try to learn about executive functions with your kids when you bring them in to my quiet office where I'm one adult with one kid. There's nothing to do with what happens in real life where you're in groups of kids or you're at home and there's various things going on, and I have to figure out about your executive functions. So I'm kind of in trouble, right? Because it's very well structured. It's very simple sets of stimuli that the kids are seeing. So I have to come up with crazy things, and I didn't come up with this. This is an old neuropsych test. But like this, where I give this kid this complicated figure, right? And I put it in front of him and I say, I want you to copy this. And you can say, well, who cares? What does that have to do with anything? Well, it's my feeble attempt to try to recreate complexity and to say to the kid, don't take a picture of this, okay? Because it is a tool. We're not supposed to have, it's not in your handout for that reason. If you have a traumatic brain injury, we might ask you to copy this. But I say to him, copy it, because I want to hit him with a whole bunch of information he hasn't seen before. New, unfamiliar information is harder for the executive functions. And there's a lot of it that he has to integrate, and he has to copy it, so he has to integrate visual and motor. So let's say I put this in front of you. Where would you start? The rectangle? I hear the rectangle. What else? The X? Maybe this horizontal and vertical line? Then you can fill in things like the face or the other details, right? Because it's too much information to get all at once. You want to step back and get the big picture. You're being hit with a lot, and you're going to step back and try to say, what's the big picture? And then I'm going to fill in the details. Okay, here's a copy by a guy who I've followed all his life. This is when he was 7. He's now graduating from the University of Michigan and going to math grad school. He's very, very smart. He happens to also have Asperger's syndrome. And this is how he copied it. And first of all, it's pretty good copy, right? Yes. Looks like this. Second of all, executive function is not about the knowledge. It's about the process, right? So that's why you see the different colored pencils, because I want to know how did he go about it. So where do you think he started? What color pencil? Green. He started up here in the corner. He went down here and made this. Then he went with the blue. Do you see how he made this little triangle here? Did you think about that as a separate figure? He made what I think of as an X by making 6 separate lines, right? So now are you impressed that he made it all come together? I mean, that's hard work, right? So he made a good copy. His teacher thinks he's got the information. She's just taught him a whole new idea about 3 causes of the revolution, and he's nodding his head and asking a good question. But then he shows up at the test, and he does this. Because this is what he does when I take the picture away so he can't see it, and I ask him to draw what he remembers. And he doesn't have a memory problem. This kid is basically a rocket scientist, right? He's gone off to math grad school. His hard drive is fine, but he didn't integrate that information in the beginning in a way that he could hold on to it to give it back, right? Here's the ADHD kid. So he does a really quick version, right? Because he's in a hurry. He's a little impulsive, right? But again, you can see how he's not integrating that base rectangle. right? He's not putting in even all of the other core lines. So again, when I take it away, he doesn't have enough information. So the job of the kid is to learn new information, and these executive, organization, and integration deficits make it hard to do that. And they make it hard to do it in the classroom, and they make it hard to do it in the playground. Any of you said to your kid, why don't you learn from your mistakes? Okay, I have, I admit it. Why don't you learn from your mistakes? It's harder to learn from your mistakes when you don't integrate a big picture automatically or intuitively. It's harder when you're juggling 12,000 details to figure out what was important there and what you need to do next. And so when we think about these organization and integration deficits, when we're thinking about can't versus won't, we're thinking about some kids who seem to get stuck on details, other kids who really don't seem to understand the idea of a goal, right? Who can say, yeah, you know, I want to be a doctor. But they don't have any idea that if they truly want to be a doctor, they probably should do their homework tonight, right? That there's this long-term goal and that there's these pieces that are going to lead up to it. That's big picture thinking, and that can be harder. Kids who have trouble with integration also tend to behave less well in big unstructured groups of peers because there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more to integrate and to try to figure out. So these are the kinds of can't, not, won't distinctions that we need to make when we think about these organization deficits. Anybody have a kid who talks your ear off but doesn't write a well-organized paragraph or paper, right? That's an executive problem, right? They've got a lot of ideas, but to put it together into that topic sentence thing and then the supporting ideas, that's an executive thing. And that kid is going to be helped by being given really structured rubrics, which Lab certainly knows how to do, and learning routines for how do I do that organization step. So those are some of the accommodations that we use. But the other thing is you got to emphasize goals. You've got to really be very explicit. And part of what you're going to learn to do to teach executive functions is to live aloud, as Brenda Smith-Miles says. You're going to talk through what seems intuitive and obvious to you, but what is not obvious to your kids. Much of what you're doing is making the implicit explicit. And so what we're going to talk more about is this idea of I'm going to be very specific about I have a goal, you know, and it can be about anything in your life. I have a goal, which is that we get to go on vacation to the Bahamas. But we got to save some money to do that. And so we're not going out tonight. I'm making mac and cheese, right? You know, whatever example it might be that comes to you, you're living out loud this idea that my behavior is regulated by these big picture goals. That's fundamental. You're also going to recognize that there are strengths for these guys in going step by step. And so very explicit rules, recipes, checklists, routines, that enables them to create the big picture by going step by step. And that's fine. That's their wheelchair ramp, okay? No problem with that. When you have kids who have behavioral issues, you're going to break down for them into flow charts and other visual tools, sort of how my actions lead to outcomes, right? John has a book I want. I hit John, I take the book. I miss my TV time because I get a timeout. Was that actually what I wanted? Step by step and visual. Get a whiteboard if you have a kid who needs this kind of thing so you can write on it. Because then you get to go back and say, okay, let's think about a different way this could have gone. What if I'd asked John for a turn? We looked at the book. Given it back, I got TV time. Would have that been a better outcome? I've broken down something that happened really fast between two kids, too fast for him to really integrate and understand, into a step-by-step thing where he can look at it, think about it, and try to learn from it. Okay, so that's about making the big picture explicit. Those are the kinds of accommodations and tools we use for that. Let's talk about working memory and planning. And if your kid has problems with working memory, the can't, not, won't distinction is about, is this a kid who won't follow directions, who won't work independently, who won't do what I ask, or is this a kid who actually can't keep track of what was said? This is a really easy experiment to do, right? If you get a whiteboard and you write down on the kid the 2 steps that you want them to do, and they're better at doing it than when you ask them to do it, your kid has a working memory problem. Right? Does this make sense? And if your kid has a working memory problem, then the first thing you have to learn to do is shut up. which is hard because most of us parents like to talk. And particularly when our kid's not doing what we want them to do, we talk more, we talk louder, we talk at more length, and yet they're not processing all that information very effectively. Yeah?
What if they can't read?
If they can't read, then you're going to do visual icons, and those are not hard to do. These days on the internet, you can get an image for anything. So for my littlest one, the last one, I was like, I'm doing it right this time. So, we got the dressing routine. I just went on the internet, and there's a little picture. And actually, you can even better take a picture of the kid himself, the picture of the kid fully dressed. That's the goal, right? And then the next picture is like the shirt, check, right? The pants, that kind of thing. So the technology is definitely our friend here. Technology can provide lots of supports from the littlest ones up to the high schoolers who can use their handheld smartphone for something useful like their calendar. It can send an alarm about when they need to do, turn in their homework or go to the doctor or whatever it is you may want them to do. You can do even these computer-based curricula. And here I think Lab is so good at this that there's many, many examples you guys could give to me. But I'm going to hurry along. So talking less, writing more, using more pictures, learning things on a computer. Computers actually support a lot of executive functions. There's a reason why all our kids are obsessed with them, right? And if we can direct them towards the positive components of the computers, we can be taking advantage of what they provide, which is a visual cue. The kid can slow down often the process and go back and forth to the material that's there. And they don't have to listen to that voice telling them what the next step is. Now, there's a couple other more general accommodations that I want to talk about quickly. These are fundamental to turning things around so that you and your kid or you and your student or therapy client have a really productive and positive relationship. And that is that you yourself have to be flexible, as we discussed, and you also have to keep it positive. And this is the most supported thing I'm going to tell you tonight. There's like 40 years of evidence and research that shows that you change behavior by telling people what they're doing right, not by telling them what they're doing wrong. And you want a praise to correction ratio of 4 or 5 to 1. And so you can do an experiment on yourself. You can mark on one hand when you give a praise and on the other hand when you give a correction. And you can see what your ratio is. And if you're anything like me, it ain't 4 to 1, okay? Because that's hard. Because the praise has to be specific and true. You are not allowed to tell your kid that he's like God's gift, right? You have to say something that he believes, that she knows is actually accurate about herself. So I'm going to give you a little example from me and my third kid, right? This was the one I was getting everything right on. Except only he wanted to learn the violin, and he has really very poor, like me, very poor ability to appreciate tones, like kind of tone deaf, let's say that. And he doesn't have great fine motor control. But he wants to learn the violin. He's committed to that. And he is massacring this instrument. I mean, it is painful. And I am really, tense. Like, Max, that's just awful. Like, stop, slow down, do this, do that. And he's like getting increasingly agitated and finally bursts into tears. And I'm like, just quit the violin then, And that's our practice. And we have a number of those. And then I think, well, maybe I should try practicing what I preach, okay? So the next day I go into practice with him, and it's like, okay, I got to catch the praise really fast. Max, I love how you got started. You open that book up and you're started. It's a specific praise, right? And I love how you're holding the violin up high, just like your teacher told you to, okay? And then there's a series of like horrible scratching noises, but then there's a passage that actually is in tune. That sounds in tune, Max, right? That's great. That is so much better than yesterday, okay? And what happened was he is definitely not going to be a concert violinist. And I don't even know if he's going to make it into the orchestra. He's trying out right now. But he is actually enjoying it and wants to keep playing it. And I feel so much better the afternoons that I spend with him on this practicing routine, right? He's relaxed, I'm relaxed, because I turned around the way I was interacting with him. So I give you that example because this is really hard to do. But I tell you, if you want to take one thing from this lecture, you got to go home and try this. Try it on a Saturday, not a work morning where you're trying to get everybody off, and try it on a day when you're feeling pretty good. And but think about what is the trouble point between you and your kid, whether it's homework or bath time or whatever it may be. Okay, keep it positive. So, and then the last thing I want you to think about here in terms of this set of things that you're going to do to make life work more smoothly with your kid is this issue of overload. If you have bad executive functions and think about yourself the morning you didn't get your coffee or you're hungry, you are so much more easily overloaded, okay? So our guys tend to get more overloaded. And they show it in different ways. Some of them shut down and just don't really process or talk back. Some of them get anxious. Some of them get irritable. But whatever they do, it's not good. It's not productive. And as parents, you've come to recognize it. And you know when your kid is really not responding. And as adults, most of us have exactly the wrong response. Because once a person is overloaded, they are actually not in this teachable moment, right? The teachable moments happen when we're calm, right? And this is true, by the way, of your spouse, who also will respond well to the 4-to-1 ratio, and your mother-in-law, okay? For all of us human beings, when we're feeling overwhelmed, we don't learn new things. And when we are really overwhelmed and upset, the other people around us get more overwhelmed or unhappy or ineffective at the way we interact. So as your kid gets overloaded, you will be less effective too with them. Naturally, they will be less able to hear what you're saying. This is the part where you need to really shut up. Nobody's going to learn anything right now. You're going to wait until he comes back down, okay? And for some kids, and the inflexible kids, it takes a long time to come back down. And until you learn how long your kid needs, you're not going to be effective because you're going to be pushing at times when he just needs that space. So avoid overload. Now, as you will notice, I'm reminding you of the goal. I'm telling you we have a plan, and I'm walking you through the steps of the plan. This is an executive function script, and now I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about what that is because it's at the core of how we teach new executive functions. Okay? Remember, executive functions is that dissociation between knowing and doing. If we want to teach good executive functions, we have to bridge that dissociation. And we will never do it by just telling the kid what to do, right? Because they know often what to do. We have to do it by doing, okay? So the strategy is going to be that we're going to embed teaching in the real world. You guys are the fundamental interventionists, you guys and the teachers. And we're going to do it by showing, modeling, and coaching, okay? So this is not the math lesson. This is not, I tell you how to add and subtract, you go do it, good, check. This is the sports coaching model, the musical lesson learning model. This is the situation in which you are having to learn a new skill by doing it, by seeing it modeled by somebody, by doing it wrong, by having them help you try it again. Anybody here have kids in sports? Yeah, and like my kids all play soccer, right? They're 4, they're 5, they're 10, they're 15. They do the same darn drill in the soccer practice, right? Where the one runs down the field, the other one runs on the other side. They kick it over to him, and he kicks it in the goal. And then they show up at the game, and they screw it up, right? And we don't think they have a bad coach. We think that this is a skill that takes a lot of time and practice to learn, right? You don't play scales in tune on whatever instrument you play the first or the second or the fifth or the 10th time. You have to go over and over it. So when you teach executive functions, you are about teaching by doing through repetition. You are about scaffolding the support, right? So I'm going to show you how to do it. If I'm going to teach you to ride a two-wheeler bike, I'm actually going to hold on to the back of the seat until you stop wobbling. Because if I put you on the bike and I let go and you fall off, you don't have a great feeling about learning to ride a bike, and you're going to have more trouble next time. So I'm going to structure and support your learning until I see you're getting it, and then I fade away. Okay? And it's the same thing with these executive functions. I'm going to cue and remind and support until I see that you're starting to do them on your own, and then I'm going to fade them away. And that's teaching by doing. And I'm going to use a lot of those visual supports we talked about, and we're going to have fun because every human being learns better when they're having fun. And now let me tell you just a little bit about these scripts and special words that are going to help kids learn how to use their executive functions. And I'm going to skip over the why be flexible here, and I just want to remind you that, again, if you have executive function problems, you have a serious ginger problem, right? Anybody watch Peanuts when you were little? The grown-ups are all going, wah, 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 right? Well, here's Ginger. The man's talking to her. I've had it. You stay out of the garage. This is what Ginger hears, blah, 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 Ginger, blah, 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 Ginger, right? This is you talking, right? So you want to avoid that talking. The kid has working memory, organization, integration problems. They're not going to do well with that. You want to bring the kid back to the big picture, the key thing, and you want to give them a few words that they can practice and learn, and that then you can leverage those at the moment when they really need them, okay? So a kid is getting really frustrated with a homework assignment or with the fact that things aren't going the way they want. You've practiced this idea of there's a plan A and a plan B, right? And you've modeled plans A's and plans B's throughout your living. Like, I thought we were going to get to church on time, but this traffic obviously is telling me we're not going to get to church on time. We need a plan B. You know, you've talked that through, so when the kid gets to the movie theater and the movie he wants to see is sold out, you can reference this plan B, and he understands where it's coming from, and he understands it's something that we all confront. It's normal to have plan Bs. There's nothing that wrong with him or you that the plan A didn't work. Plan A's never work. You always go to plan B's. Likewise, big deal, little deal. Something a big deal? Well, can we make it into a little deal? And you demonstrate this, right? Your spouse comes home and he's really late or she's really late, and you're like, this is a big deal, honey. How are you going to make it a little deal? You know, am I going to get a foot rub out of this? You know, whatever it is, you're using this language with each other on a regular basis. I want to show you, I know it's 8:30. Can I have like 5 more minutes? Is that okay? I just want to show you this clip. This is a teacher. This is Maurice Tome in DC Public School. He's using a script, and he's using it just as it came up. And I just want to give you this visual example because this is the kind of thing I want you guys to do in your everyday life. So he's using one of those old flip charts because it's DC Public Schools, not lab, and so they still have the flip charts, right? And something happens, and he uses it as a teaching moment.
Paper from last week. It was the last one.
Why didn't you just write on the...
My plan A was to use the next sheet, and then it wasn't there. Then I had to change it, and I went to go get a pad. And the other pad I had in there that was new, it was upside down, and all the paper was rippled. And the pad was ruined. So then my plan B didn't work. So then I needed a plan C. So I put it back up, and I just taped up the paper. Did it work out okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a little deal, right? All right.
A couple key things here. He just spontaneously, plan A, plan B, plan C, just a little deal. The kids helped him. They helped him with the script. They've learned this script. Your kids, if they can help you be more goal-oriented or flexible at a key moment, they will really then learn that material for themselves. We all actually tend to learn better when we teach. And this is the kind of thing that you just do on a daily, regular basis as you have the opportunities. There's one more script I want to introduce. This is the one that we've been using to organize this talk, which is the goal, why, plan, do, check. This is the big picture idea that before you do something that you might have trouble with, we're going to know what the goal is, and we're going to know why we're doing it, because motivation is important. We're going to have steps and plans A's and maybe plan B's, and then we're going to check at the end, did it work? This can be with a homework assignment. My goal is to get an A on the essay. Why? Because I really love this book and I want to get my ideas across, or I want to be a lawyer, whatever it is. And my plan is, well, I'm going to write it a couple days in advance so that my teacher can look it over, whatever the steps may be that will make me effective in writing that essay. And then I'm also going to plan that I need to put in 3 hours on Tuesday and 4 on Thursday, and then I'll be done. And at the end, I'm going to go back and check, did I meet my goal? Did I write a really good essay? Did I do it in the amount of time that I needed to do to get it done? That's another example of an academic plan, goal, why, do, check. I want to give you a couple quick examples of how this looks with older kids. How many of you have kids who are secondary school age? Okay, so what I've been talking about so far is the way we've developed Unstuck and On Target for elementary school age kids. We're now running trials in Fairfax with middle and high school kids. And you can't quite do the same thing as kids get older. You know, is this a big deal or a little deal? F you, Mom. You know, right? But some scripts work really well. And one is to come back to this idea of, you want power. You're a teenager. You're trying to get out there on your own. You want, is it power, autonomy, whatever it is your kid wants, that's what we're trying to increase for you. And we're going to still use that big picture idea. We might talk about keeping our eyes on the prize. Some kids really like that. We might still use that compromise word as we develop a more kind of structured formula for, if I get this flexibility thinking, this big picture thinking, that's going to give me more power, more choices, more goals, more rewards. You have to know what the kid wants here. Motivation is the golden goose. But you think about what it is that your kid is motivated by, and then you write their equation for what it is they need to do to get there. Do they need to use goal, why, plan, do, check? Do they need to get away from getting stuck on details? As we move into high school, we talk about this kind of power loss, power boosters, you know. So when I get stuck, I'm losing power. When I'm flexible, I'm gaining power. And it pushes me up on this balance of keeping my eyes on the prize. These are all ways that we have adapted the scripts to make them fit for older kids. The other thing that we've done for older kids who have such issues with time management is we've made these pies. These are called our time pies. And this one is actually from federal data. Does anybody have kids in college? You're paying tuition? Okay, I do, and I think you will find this very scary. This is how the average college student spends their time, okay?
It's funny. It's, you know, he has 2 classes in a day and still has problems managing.
Yeah, right, right. And this is how they're spending their time. But this is actually the goal, because this is the average, right? So we show kids this who are in high school and thinking about headed to college, and we talk about what all these pieces are, and then they make their own pies. And we talk about, are these danger pies or balance pies, right? Right? Well, we might have an issue there. Yeah, right? And the kids themselves can kind of look at it and go, ooh. So we have some of our kids show up and their whole pie is playing video games. And the other kids are like, that's not going to work for you, you know? And then we're leveraging their engagement. But what we're doing here is giving them the big picture, right? This is what happens if you don't turn that video game off at a certain point. This is what your day ends up looking like. We're going to visualize that, and we're going to work on it together in the context of what you really want to get done with your life. What do you want to do to become more powerful? And we take that goal, why, plan, do, check, and we make it a little bit more kind of visual for folks, where they're kind of moving along this pattern where they set the goal, they think about why, they do their steps, and they're headed towards whatever this power motivator is that they care about. I'm going to show you one last slide, and this is the data from our first trial with the elementary school kids with using these scripts and having teachers teach them and teaching parents how to use them. And the takeaway from here is that we did this pretty rigorously. We compared 2 groups of kids, and they got 2 different interventions, both of which were the same intensity. So everybody got the same amount of attention and focus, and good materials provided in both. One set of kids was taught these unstuck scripts. The other was taught, these were autistic kids and more social skills kinds of routines. And what happened was we got really big improvements in all the kids, as you do when you do an intervention, but even bigger, more betterer improvements in these key executive function skills, like do you follow the rules in the class, right? Do you participate? Do you make transitions? We got much more improvement with the kids who did unstuck. So we have some evidence. We're getting more, as I said, in ADHD. But we're really trying to test this rigorously because most of the things that are out there for executive function, there's no scientific basis for. And some of them may work for some kids and some of them may not. And we want to try to understand why. So the last thing you've gotten in your handout is just a bunch of other great books by folks. And thank you very much for letting me go over. I appreciate it. So I'm happy to answer questions. I'm going to have to repeat what you say, and I don't have very good working memory, so don't make it too long. Yes?
copies of your book here tonight, Sarah?
No, I don't. The blue book is a good book if you want to kind of learn how to live this and teach it on a daily basis at home or in the course of other things you do. And you can get both books on Amazon. This is what they look like. Or from Brooks, the publisher, but I don't sell them.
So which one do you recommend for parents?
Oh, I already forgot. I screwed up. She said, do you have a copy of the book here tonight? What's your question?
I'm sorry, but could you tell, you mentioned very quickly which one you recommend for parents and which one is?
This one, for parents and people and teachers. It's written for parents and teachers who are trying to, like that teacher you saw in the course of their daily life, reinforce these executive skills. This is still written for kids with autism. If your kid doesn't have autism, you know, there are parts of this that may not help you. But again, think about what their executive challenges are. If you want to support the working memory and the planning, there's a chapter in there on that. If you want to support the organization, there's another chapter on that. Yes? We wished we had done, Michelle Garcia Winter wrote Social Thinking, which is wonderful. It was Jed Baker's social skills program. Now in our new trial, we're actually comparing it to behavior management, contingency behavior management. She was asking if in the trial we were comparing it to a specific other intervention that's really good. Any other questions?
Could you say the name of that other intervention too?
Michelle Garcia Winter is the author. She's very much an author for autism. And social thinking is one of the most powerful social skills interventions out there. She also has things about flexibility and Flexible U. Is that the name of the intervention? FlexiPlex. Yeah. And particularly for younger kids, I don't think it works up as well, but some kids love it. This curriculum is good for kids through elementary school, and there's a conference in May. I bet you Michelle Garcia Winter's coming. She's done a lot of that. She needs to get that studied. There's no evidence. It's really smart stuff, and I love it, but you don't have the scientific evidence base with that. Other questions? Yeah. The first option that I have exercised heavily with my first two kids, the second one's too young, is a gap year. Right?
During the gap. You can't go to work with
What do you do when your kid is graduating from high school and you're hearing this lecture and you're thinking he's not ready for college, right? That's your question.
or even work seems a bit of a stretch.
Yeah. The good thing about work, though, is it has a lot of those natural consequences. So the kid gets in there, and if you have a kid who is not motivated, who is really, you've brought him to places like lab, or you've had tutors or therapists working with him, and he's really not with the program, then sometimes what they need to do is go out and have a failure experience. Not because we want the kid to suffer, and I don't want this for the elementary school kid, but for the older adolescent, they need to actually for themselves learn the why of executive function improvement, right? And so sometimes, they do need to go and have that experience. There are also a lot of specific programs, though, for transitioning to college, right, that provide a much softer, more supportive environment for going out and practicing those kinds of skills. College living experience being one of them.
What was the example?
College living experience. It's programs that support kids moving from high school to college who need more intensive work on actually doing their laundry, or the kid who you're worried he's not going to get up for class. He's never gotten up by himself for class yet. If you have one of those and you're in high school, stop getting that kid up. Okay, right now, right? You've got some time to practice that skill, right? And that's where a little bit of failure may be what's needed. And no, you're not going to call the school and excuse him for being late. He's going to deal with all those pieces himself. But the college living experience can help kids make some of those transitions too. You mentioned recovery time from overload. How long are we thinking about? 10 minutes, 20 minutes, a couple days? The answer is it really depends. Some kids are really different. But one of the things that we do in the book is we have a little worksheet for you to kind of work through with overload, to think about what the signs are that your kid gives that they are getting overloaded, what works to get them calmed down, and also this idea that you're going to kind of get a feel for what that kid shows when they're overloaded, because that's how you're going to know when they're not. And for some kids, it's a long process. If it's going on more than an hour, you probably want a behaviorist to come and help you kind of watch and see what might be happening, but it's not always a 5-minute thing. I mean, think about yourself, you know, and your own experience of when you've gotten really overloaded and what you needed to do. Yes. Yeah, the brain is such a complicated thing. She wants to know why in that list of inflexible behaviors do kids just exhibit some of them and not all of them? And you know, we're really working to try to understand that. What's the core component of inflexibility that we can flag? And it's really different in different kids. And we initially, like I say, developed these for kids with autism who have some patterns of inflexibility. I never thought we would be able to use it with kids with ADHD. But it was actually my colleague who works with kids with ADHD, Christy Hardy, who said, you know, this like works. So there's similarities among different kinds of diagnoses, sometimes more similarities than there is within the diagnosis, and I can't tell you why. Yeah. So the question is coaching, executive function coaching. If your kid goes once a week for like an hour, is that effective, or are you playing whack-a-mole where you might get them to do one thing, but they're not able to carry that through? The fundamental truth that I want to get across tonight, and this comes from the work of others, as I say, with kids with other kinds of disabilities, is executive function skills have to be taught in the real environment, in the kid's environment, right? So, the power of the executive function coach can be huge, but they need to communicate to you as parents, to the teachers, and to other people, what are the things that we are all working on together here to reinforce, to move forward, right? And that's really powerful with an elementary school kid. So when we do these interventions, and we do them in the schools, and then we train the parents, and the kids learned, plan A, plan B at school, and the mom that afternoon says, we need a plan B. This is a real anecdote. The kid goes, how do you know that word? And they're so excited because their world is lining up. Remember, they don't integrate really well. So the world is lining up for them, and it's getting to be consistent, and they need that consistency. As kids get older, there's this other thing that happens, like when we're launching kids off to college, which is, we can't as parents necessarily be the primary teachers. And some of the best executive function coaches I've seen at that point are actually more available to the kid than just that hour. Right? So whether they text back and forth or they have routines so that they can reach into that kid's life at key moments.
So significant.
So the comment is about flexibility and having inflexibility come in generations in a family. And it sounds like in your family it's getting passed down on the male side, and to the point where your son is really working on it in a residential program and working on this issue of empathy. And I think that can be very important, and there can be different things that feed into the inflexibility. As a sort of inflexible person myself, what I can tell you is, you can help us get through these hard moments. My husband has learned, he doesn't just say to me, hey, let's just go out, it's a beautiful day, let's just go out to pick some apples, right? He says, I'm thinking maybe we should do something different, like go to an orchard today. Think about it and let me know in 10 minutes, right? And then I'm not on the spot, right? I have time to accommodate to this new idea, right? And so, there are these things that we do just to try to help people, whether they're our fathers or spouses or children, because their brains just don't automatically shift gears in the same way. Now, I don't think that's going to necessarily, you're talking about some really serious issues, and I'm not trying to trivialize those at all.
Factoring in that thinking time,
but-
which you're talking about is, that's
Yeah. Yes?
That you're talking about here.
Thank you for asking that question. She's asking, I had a slide that made a reference to the Socratic method, and why is that there, and how would I use that? And You understand the Socratic method, you probably all do. It's just a method where you ask questions to help a person come to a new understanding. And the reason it's really important with kids with executive dysfunction is one thing that is, if we're trying to make the implicit explicit, if we're trying to kind of live our experience for them, we really need to know where they're at. And that coaching model where I'm going to scaffold and support you as far as you need to go means I have to be a pretty damn good attuned parent or teacher or therapist. And the Socratic method helps me to do that. So I need to know, you have to write this paragraph, you're melting down. I need to know what it is that you need to do to write the paragraph and what you don't. And so that's what I'm thinking there. Yeah.
I don't know. I've
Yeah.
got to explain myself.
No, I think that's a really good question. She's asking about self-awareness, and with an 8-year-old daughter, how do you cope with the fact that she doesn't express that she has these struggles or problems? And 8-year-old, what do you do when you have an 18-year-old that you're looking up at who also doesn't seem aware? This is a fundamental job that you have as parents of kids with executive dysfunction, is you are trying to build that self-knowledge. Because over time, what we're looking for is these accommodations that you're providing, the kid is asking for, right? You want the kid, by the time they're launching off to college, to know it really matters to me to have notes before the lecture. So if for some reason this teacher is not putting them up, I need to talk to him, right? And to be able to do that. But you have to build that self-awareness in such a way that you're building self-esteem and the hope of the kid and the belief that they can move forward, which is partly where that praise to correction ratio comes in, and partly where, frankly, to toot neuropsychology's horn, a neuropsychological kind of approach comes in, because what you want to do is be always talking about what the kid's strengths are, and then where often I use a language like glitches, right? This is something, we all have glitches, this is something that's hard for me, I wonder if this would be helpful to you. So again, you're kind of talking out loud that process by which you're recognizing, God, you have such a great vocabulary, that's so cool. But it looks to me like it's hard for you to put it together, and maybe often for kids displacement helps. Maybe you had that experience, or you knew somebody who had that experience, and I know somebody who did this, and does that help you?
No, that really helps to sort
Yeah.
of say that maybe you're needing to give them the ideas and the language to put to what they're experiencing and don't understand.
And not too much language, little bits of language. You're cracking the door for the 8-year-old on these issues. But because you guys have the long view in mind, you're looking for those well-functioning 21-year-olds, you've got time, but you want to start the process one small piece at a time. And you don't push it beyond where the kid's ready to develop self-awareness, because that will backfire. Yes?
Do any of this.
Right,
with her because she,
right.
It's like there's no,
Right. So the question is, she has a high school, how old's your daughter?
she's in 9th grade.
So she has a 9th grader who's not open to any parental support whatsoever and isn't getting good grades, but there's no ability to kind of engage. And it sounds like there may be a couple things happening that happen often. One is when a kid is kind of grown up having some of these negative experiences over time, they will take on labels that they've heard other people give, like I didn't care about it, or it was boring, or, to kind of protect and push away. And the other thing is a really normal developmental stage, which is it's her job to grow up, and it's kind of good that she wants to push you away, right? But then it's so hard for us parents to watch that, and I've gone through that myself, where it's like, but I want to help you, and so one of the things that you can think about is whether there needs to be a helping person in her life, like the executive coach or the therapist, somebody who she could talk to about how she perceives this issue. And part of that, getting her to somebody like that, is just framing with her not how are you going to, how are your grades, how are you going to do, but what do you want to do? What are your hopes? What are your dreams? Where are you trying to go? To get anything from her about something that she might be headed for that's that goal that then you can say, can we think of anybody who could help you with this? To kind of engage in that more positive way. This is really hard to do, but I think we have to reach back and reignite her motivation. And you're not the only one in this situation. So, does anybody else have other advice for her? Okay, one last question, and then we're going to stop. Yes.
With this whole scripted,
Yeah.
skill-based,
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any insights.
So the question is, she's got 2 kids, one who she's thinking is more typically developing, who's younger, who's surpassing an older kid who has a lot of executive challenges and processing speed challenges. And you want the younger kids buy-in.
Buying,
To-
a lot of the source of frustration is when the older one gets stuck and the younger one has no sympathy or,
Right.
you know.
Right, so the older one gets stuck and the younger one is not sympathetic. So I think there's a couple key things that I bet you you're doing these things, but just to go over them. I mean, it is hard to be the sibling of a stuck brother or sister. And siblings do need breaks. They didn't sign up for this. You didn't sign up for it, but you don't have any choice. You want to give your other kid a little choice and make sure that he has other times and activities and things that are away from the kid, that the older sibling. You really benefit in this situation from that really positive frame of everybody's strengths, and really explicitly talking about what everybody in your family does well. And then 5 may be a little young, but pretty soon thereafter, it's really okay to say to a sibling, let's sit down and talk about this, because, Sammy has these certain glitches, and I can see when they're happening, and it's making you mad, and sometimes it makes me mad, and tell me about what it feels like, right? And also, these are some things that I think we can really do to help him. And I know if you needed help, he'd want to help you. So you're kind of trying to really frame this very explicitly, but a lot of times what we don't do is talk to our kids about it, and so they're kind of confused. And they make that can't, won't mistake just like we do. And so pulling that back and sort of saying, this is something you really can't do, can be helpful. Okay, we're going to stop now. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.